You already had those.
Yeah.
You can share. I am going to call to order the Board of Education. Did you just call to order the Board
just real
of
quickly.
Finance? Okay.
Board of Finance called to order, 7:31.
Okay, this is our second joint Board of Education, Board of Finance meeting for the purpose of consideration of the proposed 2018-19 operating budget. I think last week we had a very productive meeting and a lot of really helpful information was conveyed, and I hope we answered your questions. Before we pick up where we left off, I think, for the purposes of people at home, since we don't have too many people in our viewing audience seems to have dropped off tonight. I just think it's worthwhile to restate that we essentially have the same goal, which is to ensure the efficient funding of our school system. Last week, several members of your board mentioned that you guys represent Wilton's taxpayers. And while that's certainly true, I think it's also true that we do too. The Board of Education represents the taxpayers in providing students with an excellent education, with supporting our town's most important asset, and with delivering efficient, responsible budgets that help keep us competitive with our Durgay counterparts. So I just think it's important to keep that in mind, that we are all working for the same goal. And with that, we're happy to pick up if you'd like to.
We agree with that.
Get going. Thank you.
And
I
we're
knew
all
you
on the
would.
same salary, too.
And we're all on the salary, right?
Okay, what I suggest we do is we pick up where we left off last time, and then after that, which isn't a lot left, and we got through most of the questions, the structured questions. And then we had a couple other things that kind of came in since then, one from Walter who couldn't be here tonight. We have two members that couldn't make it because of business commitments. And then we'll just kind of go around and have some, what I'll call free-form comments, because John had some, and maybe some of the other ones as well. And then we'll just wrap it up with that, okay? So where we were last time was the top of the page, alternative high school necessary, and the sub one down below. Since we're not having that in the budget, it makes a little sense to talk about it. So let's skip over those and start with the, pick it up where future staffing projection flat, and this is something that Richard wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I think I touched on this last time, and I complimented Anne and her team on the budget workbooks that went out. And I mentioned that I was disappointed that there wasn't much energy put into the out years. And I'm not sure how much can be done about that this year, but certainly next year I would like to see the budget workbooks in a state that the principals and other administrators can actually change the FTE and automatically change their projections for the out years. Not very difficult to do. And maybe the spreadsheet even does it, but I noticed that nobody tried changing things for the out years. And, one of the ideas of the 3-year forecast is to try to anticipate how we're going to take advantage of changing enrollment. Looks like a downward trend, but who knows? It may change as we review it year by year. But certainly just leaving it flat in a period of changing enrollment is not good. So we want to see some sort of reflection of that, because I think it'll help the planning process.
Yeah, the question was why was it left flat? Was that because we just decided we're going to?
It's new work. No, it was new work doing the out-year planning, particularly at the building level. So that, and to your point, Richard, we're going to revisit that in this current year. And so there are several parts of that. One is tuning the classroom projections, so those need to align to enrollment. But the second piece is Andre is committed to working with the special ed staff through a process of creating staffing models, and that will certainly influence those numbers one way or the other, whether it's increase, decrease, or other. And then the other piece is there are just some unknowns that we deal with. We don't have good models for forecasting what the unknowns are. Okay. But that's I guess the short answer is it continues to be a work in progress.
So can I interpret as looking for that next year?
Well, I think before, I mean, this is, I guess, the way what I'm suggesting is for my team, that's work this year, as we go forward. So this process doesn't pick up from, 0 point in the fall. We'll continue to refine those numbers.
Okay. from a standpoint of how many years it's been to get to this point, thank you for getting there. I think we're making steps that are starting to get into the projections, and that's really the way to manage an organization like this into the future. So we're getting there, and this is a big step this year just to have it in. And if we keep refining that, I think you'll find it's a good tool for trying to anticipate what kinds of costs you'll have going forward. Next is conferences and consulting spending priorities.
So the question that I had around that was, and I'll just read it, and the budget has changed from the first cut to the second cut, and I'll try to incorporate the changes that you've made, but cost for training and conferences, code 3221, it was budgeted to increase by 18%, but that's been changed now to 4%, up to $374,000. And I don't want to nitpick, every single item in the budget, but that's one where there's a 29% increase over the 3-year period. And over the 5-year projection, there's an increase of 69%, with a decreasing student and teacher population, in addition to the tuition reimbursement, which is up 50% from 2 years ago. Significant increases, and the question really is, for me, and this is, again, this is my first year on this board, while education is different in private industry, conference costs would be among the first areas that are really looked at hard in dealing with budget constraints. So the 69% increase over the 5-year budgeting period really jumped out at me. The 29% increase over the 3 years jumped out, and just the aggregate cost of $400,000, which when I try to add up the number of teachers in the budget, if I cut out the custodial staff and some others, it looks like there's about 374 people, including administration people, so that's over $1,000 per individual. I don't know how you manage that cost, but in private industry, that would be one where, okay, we want to make sure that we don't take any money away from the students, and before we ever get to the point where people are considering cuts to textbooks and library books, that we'd first look at that cost center. And I saw there's some responses here, but I'm wondering how you manage that cost, and whether that's an area that might be, before we cut from either teachers or teaching materials, is that one where you might have some opportunity, given that it's already increased significantly from 3 years ago. So is there some opportunity in that line item for?
You already saw the reduction in the line.
Yes.
So I would say the answer to that is yes, there is. I think the other point, Stuart, is as we, our one of our most significant priorities is around improving achievement, obviously. And so one of the leverage strategies is around increasing the capacity of our staff to do that. So it's been a priority in the years that I've been here to support training. And I would say, when you really go through that line and the detail of the line, it's far more training and far less conference. And so the kinds of training initiatives that are underway and we continue and then we add are around improving teachers' capacity in literacy, mathematics instruction. Andrea came forward with a number of proposals to train some of the special education staff. Do you want to just take a minute and describe plans for the psychologists?
Well, there are 3 basic training pieces that I'm proposing for 3 different constituent groups of educators. I'd like to increase the capacity of our school psychologists, and I'm proposing that we expand 1 school psychologist at each building to the level of a school neuropsychologist. I think in the long run, this will actually save money in the number of outside evaluations we end up having to do, because we need, for those very complex kids, we need more complex evaluations. So that's a piece that I think would actually in the long run help us to recover some of other funding in those consultation and evaluation lines over time. I also want to focus attention on the issues of dyslexia and work with special education teachers and our speech and language pathologists in addressing the needs of dyslexic students to ensure that they continue to achieve at high levels. I think you can see there's quite an achievement gap between our children with disabilities and children without disabilities and academic achievement. So I think that's sharpening that toolbox is critical. And then the third piece is looking at those students who are experiencing difficulties in the social and emotional and behavioral realm. And I really want to work in do a trainer of trainers model, which is always more expensive to train your own trainers.
But cheaper in the long run.
Cheaper in the long run, but more expensive up front, to train across all 4 building sites a cadre of teachers to help really shift the focus from responding to behavior. And I don't just mean explosive behavior, but things like kids being out of class in school counselors' offices, missing classes for other reasons, being upset, non-suicidal, self-mutilation behaviors, cutting, and those kinds of things that are happening in our schools, and get to a point where we can intervene and help students learn the skills to cope with the kinds of things they're struggling with that are impacting their overall achievement. So those are 3 big ticket items for training, but I think given the data we're seeing and the kinds of kids who are really struggling, the kinds of kids who are having difficulty achieving, I think those are really important and very hopefully impactful methodologies to help reduce those stressors and bring kids' achievement up.
Is the training generally done locally, or is there any flights involved to go for training?
It depends.
Is there a training that's done in-house? You know, I like the model of train the trainer, because that obviously in the long term does save money, but you do you do training where you bring people in as opposed to send individual by individual out for something that's, by the drink, which is certainly going to be.
Sure, it depends on what the training is. We do both. So, for example, in the area of technology, we might send people out to a technology training. We have work underway with Teachers College. We bring in Teachers College folks here, but we also send our staff down to Columbia. So it's dependent on what the actual training is.
Are there ever flights involved, or is it?
Periodically, there are flights. So we've sent people off to, there's an annual ISTE conference training. That's one of the big national technology conferences where a lot of the cutting edge education technology is put on display. So periodically, we'll send staff members out to that.
Is that something that's an opportunity to do more locally, or?
I don't think at that scale, because there's only one of them, and that's really, it's the showcase event for educational technology annually. I think the question would be, in trying to make trade-offs, is we either take a year off or, send only one person as opposed to 2 people or 3 people. We also have staff, by the way, who will go out and present, so it's not just receptive. We're also sharing the great work that's going on here.
One of the other questions that was part and parcel was one other significant spend, a $2.7 million spend in the area of general consulting costs, which was contract services code 3310. I didn't go back and review that one, but it was an 8.5% increase to 2.7 million, which there were separate line items that appeared to exclude fees for legal, leases, computer assistance, and technical. So one of the question was really the trade-off between consulting costs and educational costs, and what else is in the 2.7 million. Again, 8.5% increase seems like a large increase for especially such a large individual line item.
Mm-hmm. Do you have the detail of that line? 'Cause I
don't have it with me right now, but the majority is going to be residential outside.
Those costs come, they're special
Special ed
education
costs.
costs
Yeah,
for kids
the
with
outside.
very complex needs, so.
And it falls under consulting costs,
These are
Contracts,
outplacements.
outplacements.
outplacement.
Yep.
It's not typical consulting.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I can get a breakdown.
Is that the only line that the outplacements come into under contract services?
Should be, yes, unless there's.
There would also
other
be
ones.
transportation costs
Oh, yes,
associated
direct
with that.
expenses.
So the contract services would be their tuition, and then you also have their transportation costs.
Different line item for that.
And that's a separate line item.
Okay.
Okay, next is spending priorities, book purchases. John Calmreedis with you.
Well, this is, I want to say a great deal more in a few minutes, but I'm just curious why you have so few, you would sacrifice money for books rather than for personnel. For instance, when we finished the Miller Driscoll program, the Learning Center there, the library, was really in need of complete renovation, books and everything, and that doesn't appear to be here.
The library learning commons renovation, I think that was value engineered out of the renovation project. So in terms of books and library replacement books, in part, we're shifting to online resources, but also in part, we've deferred some of the replacement costs. And in setting up a dichotomy between books versus staff, I think we've gone through and looked at our staff. We continue to look at our staff, and in consultation with the entire administrative team, we didn't find any other areas where we would choose to reduce staff. So what we chose to do instead was to defer purchase of books, and that's all in trying to manage a bottom line and present a budget that's responsive to the economic climate.
But, and when you look through, and I forgot exactly where I saw it, some of the libraries are dated in 2005, haven't been improved, 1995.
The collections at Miller Driscoll and I think Cider Mill, just need to be updated. They haven't kept up with the process over a number of years. There's an annual cycle that we go through. I think the other piece that's missing from the story is where we have added and continue to add are in the classroom libraries. So I wouldn't want you to leave the table thinking that, our kids are reading all these old dated books. It's not accurate.
Because a lot of the children access the classroom libraries almost more frequently than they do the libraries.
Yeah, and that's not to say that, a school library is not critically important. It is. But, our kids have access to many, many books and current books.
And you're happy that they're up to date?
The classroom libraries, the media center libraries at Miller Driscoll and at Cider Mill need to be refreshed. They do. That was decisions made over a period of years to defer that process, and so we're not adding. We're just not investing the sum that was originally requested from Fran Compar to do it all at once.
Thank you.
Well done?
Yep.
Okay. Administrative overhead staffing, Richard.
Yeah, we touched on this last time, actually, but I'd like to revisit it because I didn't word my question very well, and Dr. Smith thought I was trying to eliminate the superintendent, yes. So
Critical to the mission.
So, as we said last time, 78% of the costs are staff related. So the main cost we can control is staff. And we've had discussion many times around this table and others that there's not a linear relationship between enrollment and staff. The nearest thing there is to linearity is with classroom teachers, obviously. And the thing that's furthest away from linearity is administrators. And that's really the point I was trying to make last week. So I wanted to clarify that. So again, to the extent that there are efficiencies to be achieved in the, I say the administrative process or anywhere else by sharing across campuses, regionalization, anything like that, I just think it'd be worthwhile to have a rigorous exercise, really discussing what's relevant and what's not, because the only thing that can really move this, if enrollment continues to decline at our most aggressive projections, we're going to have to do some aggressive realignment. And the only way to do that is to really ask the tough questions. So that's really what I would ask.
So I guess it'd be important to understand that this is not an area that's been ignored. We look at it, and we look at it annually. In fact, anytime there's an opportunity with a position, I think of particularly our school administrative ranks. A couple of things that are important to highlight. Number one, I think we have, in our DIRG anyway, one of the highest student-to-administrator ratios. So we are built to be leaner by design. But I think we also need to understand the role and the responsibility when we think about particularly the folks that operate in the building. And when we look at, the feasibility of sharing across campuses, the way the roles are currently designed makes it very difficult because the administrators are responsible for the instructional leadership, the overall building management, personnel, facilities, supervision of staff, communication. I mean, the role, and they all share in a piece of that. So the process we haven't yet engaged in a meaningful way would be to look at if we could bifurcate some of those and separate out and organize them. You know, had some conversation about, do we create a PPT facilitator position? I don't know who would want that job, honestly, because it's a tough job. So, but there are things that we could look at, but I don't think there's a short-term answer here. And I would also add, offer really as evidence of the fact that we're engaged in this process. And you look at where we've made those reductions, we've made changes. The preschool director, you already know about the consolidation efforts we've made. Transportation coordinator, we've done that through attrition. So, we continue to work on it.
Yeah. Okay. Just, but along those lines, in terms of the ratios, one of the charts that Jeff sent out to show the ratio of students to staff, and the projection for this coming year is the lowest ratio of students to staff. Now normally you'd say that's good because it's now it's projected to be sub 7 students per staff member. At the high in the past 10 years, it was up to 7.52, so the decline from 7.52 to 6.9 something yields about 40 staff people more than you would have had with that same ratio back from 2012. So and I absolutely agree with you. It's a very tough job. Looking at the presentations that you put forth at Middlebrook, showing that you've obviously gone through it at every grade level, and there's an incredible amount of detail and a lot of hard work in it. But if the trend is a declining student population, then at some point you have to address the decline. And again, like we talked about last time, not necessarily in lockstep, but certainly directionally. And it's only a question of time whether you want to start that immediately, and it is difficult, or put that off for another year. And I look, my personal view is you really have to start sooner rather than later, even though it's not fun. It's not it's not something anybody really wants to go through, and it's a very tough set of decisioning because you really don't you've got to find places where you can with attrition reduce staff, and it's never in the right place. And again, I come from private industry, so it's tough to do, but private industry, they're forced to do it.
I appreciate that. And I guess what is masked in those numbers and those ratios are the new positions that have been added over time as a result of the changing landscape. And so I was in anticipation tonight in response to a question Chris had asked. There are two parts of this. I think one is understanding what are the new positions that have been added because the work has shifted, from 10 years ago or even 8 years ago. And then will we be building on that, or where, are those temporary positions? So, and this is illustrative just to help understand why the ratio is the way it is. But in the last couple of years, we added a full-time dedicated safe school climate coordinator. That was a position that was recommended as a result of the work of the security task force. We've added, 5 math interventionists in addition to some of the other interventionists we already had on staff. 4 coaches. We had shifted some of those positions that were quasi-interventionist, quasi-coach at the lower schools. The pre-K has grown by a teacher and 2 paras. We added a year ago the Community Steps program, which was the 18 to 21 transition program. That's 5 staff members. The curriculum coordinators were also 2 new positions. And then we built out the library media specialist. So the point there is just that the work is shifting. And so it's not falling on deaf ears that we need to look at this. And I wouldn't want you to suggest that we haven't. I think maybe the growth area for us is having a tight process by which to do that.
Devin, may I? I think it might help on the administrative positions, the ones that are spelled out just as administrative, to really find a way to get a clear understanding of what the roles and responsibilities are and how the work is divided in the school. Because when I look at 3 administrative positions at Miller Driscoll for 1,000 students, that's 1 administrator for every 300 plus students. That's not a lot, guys, especially if you want our administrators to know who the students are, to have relationships with them, to recognize them, to be able to call them by name. I mean, I just, from my perspective, we're barking up a tree here that we don't need to bark up. It just, if you divide up what the responsibilities are, no, but think, but we got 1,000, no, it's still 1,000 students at Miller Driscoll almost, okay? And so it goes down to 920. It's still 300 more students, 300 students per administrator.
Yeah, the point we're making,
okay,
and I've said many times I'm not an expert on how to run education.
Yeah.
The point that's being made is as enrollment declines, at some point, the overhead has to decline.
Clearly, and in the last 4 years, we're down 20-some people. I understand that, but it is not a linear function.
I said that.
Okay, it is not.
I think we'd all
understand
agree
that.
with that, particularly in the administration.
Yeah, it is not linear,
Area.
and so, and when I think the administration here has demonstrated that when there's an opportunity at the classroom level where you can do that, they will take the steps and we'll make the changes. But the administration thing,
My question was to look at it. If the answer is we've looked at it and there's nothing can be done, that's fine. I'm not an expert. I just think it needs to be focused.
Okay.
That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
Right, and we do look at it,
And
Kevin
I
looks
think-
at it and keeps us informed, and,
Yeah.
when the conversation came up about Middlebrook, Maria Coleman was the principal, she did,
But-
an in-depth study of,
I mean, I feel.
Yeah.
I
I understand I get it, I understand that, but
We've
it's
been
not.
making the
It's the
same
gross
point
it's really the
for
gross
4
numbers.
years.
I think when you look at it, you brought up Miller Driscoll, 3 administration for 1,000 students.
Yeah.
It's tough to argue that. And so as you go through the administration lines, if there are only 22 administrators in the district, the question really is, there's 588 total personnel relative to 3,900 students, whereas several years ago, you had a 2% higher number of professionals relative to a 8.9% higher number of students. So at some point, and I take Dr. Smith's point about it's a shift in the landscape, a shifting in priorities. But I think to Richard's point, you really there are numerous ways to budget. So one way to budget, which Richard's really referring to, is a bottoms-up budget, zero-based budgeting. Okay, explain away the first head, the second head, the third. Every single individual, and I think that's probably easy to do when you look at 3 administrators for 1,000 students. But in some of the other areas where you have larger masses of personnel, I think it's much tougher, and it's certainly tougher on this side of the table for us to understand because. We see the trends as opposed to that one set of line items. We're not as focused on it and not as knowledgeable about it as you all are. So.
Right. Okay.
We kind of focus on the total staffing level, and the mix underneath that is where you're at. The reason why it's important is that we are heading, according to your own projections, to 3,500 students in 4 years. And we've dropped 9% students to date with 2% head count. If we just take that same ratio down to 0 students, we would still have 447 staff people. So clearly we can't go from where we're at today to 447 with no students. We have not been dropping the staff at the same rate that the students are going down. We've been saying this for 5 years, and it's always going to be next year and next year and next year.
It's not going to be next year, though. 'Cause I
It's
think
not.
the
It's
difference
not,
is.
guys, don't think that, please.
Yeah, and this is not an area, Jeff, where I would consider kicking the can down the road. What I'm saying is, we built a strategic plan, a set of priorities, and have been staffing to those. And I don't think the answer is only add, but it's when do you dial back and start to bend the curve in staffing, and where do those staffing come from? So, when we move down to, if it's 3,500 students, will we have the same level of need for administrators? Probably not, maybe not. I don't know, unless the composition of the kid really changes or the composition of family needs really changes. You know, if Miller Driscoll continues to contract, you know, I think we continue to ask those questions. You know, I've never thought that a school district is in the business of being an employment agency. You know, that's not our job, and certainly not our job to retain administrators or anybody. You know, our job is to serve students and families to the best we can. I think, you know, as I've observed the enrollment decline in light of what our instructional priorities are, you know, we've pared back where we can. There's evidence of that, you know, but we've also made the conscious choice to add. We could have chosen not to add, you know, and that would have consequences too.
Okay, we are down from the peak.
It's understood. You've made that point.
We're not adding to it. We are down. We're down students faster than we're down staff. That's the point.
Yep, your points.
And we bring it up every year. We'll probably bring it up again next year. Because at some point, as we shrink, we need to shrink the whole thing at the same time. The ratio of teachers to students in general ed is a pretty fixed ratio, and you've had that chart that goes back 30 years, K to 12. It's a huge grid. And they're all plus or minus 20, 21. So it's been that way for many, many years. That will shrink with the students. It's everything else beyond that block of classroom teachers, student-facing teachers. And it's that one that's the hardest to bring down as the number of classroom teachers. The base shrinks. The portion above it has to shrink proportionately. It's not easy to do. It's called consolidation, but it has to happen as we get smaller until it starts turning around. So that'll be a constant discussion we're having on it. And you know, education's expensive, and if there is a way to carve back some of that cost and start to give some relief in the tax rises in town, we're going to look for it. That's all. That's kind of one of our charges here. So.
You touched on something else there, Kevin, as well. You mentioned additional programs. I mean, things do change, and you are doing things differently. It would be interesting at some stage to lay out those additional programs and separate that from the core, so as to try to understand what the true trend is. Because Glenn, I feel your pain. I mean, I know what you're saying, it's tough on this side of the table too. We're just trying to. So you know, I think if like, you know, there were additional staff like coaches, which happens to be the next question, where you're adding staff for a reason, and that reason, among other things, is ongoing professional development for the teachers. And that's a conscious policy decision, and that's adding staff that weren't there 10 years ago. I think it's important to understand that, you know. So, again, I think too many of us on this side of the table are very quantitatively focused.
Yeah. And we've had experience in just this type of thing. So the problem is when you've got people on this side of the table who've actually worked in businesses where we had to cut head count because of business conditions. You know, and the experience, at least for me, has been that, you know, if you lean into it as opposed to try to do it all at one time, you're much better off. And, you know, I think when we, you know, when the 1% was set as a target, which was actually before I got here, I think that considered, okay, if you're attempting to shrink at the same rate that the student population is shrinking, you know, you take out 10 heads out of 570. Again, if you lean into that, that's $1 million in cost savings right there. And that's probably the difference in terms of where the budget's rolling up today versus the guidance that was given, you know, plus or minus a few other things here and there. So, and again, you know, where I come from, people have been forced to do that. And again, we consider it marginal, and you really have to work hard to your points. I mean, it's not easy, and you really have to find a way to do it without causing damage, and still fund all the things you want to get funded, like books. And that's, you know, I think the challenge. And the challenge is, you know, I'd say for you know, you who are all professional educators, it's not something that you've all been, you know, it's not where you're trained. So, and it takes away from the time of teaching and educating, which is, you know, obviously, you know, there's a conflict in terms of where you spend your time. But, you know, I think it's a challenge that has to be faced at some point in time with, you know, to Jeff's point on a decreasing population.
I want to speak up now and tell my board and talk to the Board of Education too a little bit about the staffing. And rather than doing number crunching, I decided to look at the human element And with an invitation from Dr. Jen Mitchell, and with the permission of Kevin Smith, I made a visit to Cider Mill School. And what I wanted to do was to see, what is all this instructional business about? How do these coaches work in relationship to teachers and all? And Jen was very good to give me some time in a very tight schedule. And I sat down immediately and I had a wonderful hour and a half of instruction. And I want to tell you a few things that I learned there, okay? First of all, I found that the teachers and the coaches were dedicated, conscientious, dead serious about what they were doing, very concerned about what we were going to do. Where you and I assume a conflict between coaches and the teachers, there is none. They are working so harmoniously together, and they appreciate each other so much. And this is really genuine. I met 3 coaches and sat down with different teachers to find out how this whole process works. And it's pretty clear that the teachers coming out now with their instructions and everything from school don't have all the skills to work with students that they need. And the coaches are really helping them do that. There's absolutely no resentment between the teachers and the coaches. One of the things that we're talking about is the number of administrators to the students. And I asked Jen about this, and she said, here we've got a school of Cider Mill size, 1,000 students. She said, in any other district, you're going to have much smaller schools. You're going to have fewer administrators to deal with this kind of thing. I said, well, Jen, you're working from your office all the time. She said, absolutely not. I'm out in the classroom 8 hours a day. And when you talk to the teachers, too, I learned that the very coaches who are helping the teachers are there at 6:45 to help the kids off the buses. There is and we went to a classroom, and Jeff, the classroom isn't your mother's classroom anymore. It is.
It's better.
It's just fascinating. We went to a classroom, and every child had a Chromebook, and they were writing and composing things. And Jen and I walked through, and not a child looked up. They were absolutely working there. Meanwhile, the teacher was working with a coach. Coach was working with a student, one-on-one. It was really a beehive of work. I learned a little language. I learned about vertical articulation, anchor tasks. But I also learned from the teachers that there are a lot of state mandates that have come down that said that they have to do things at a certain time with each student, and it takes a certain number of teachers and students to do this, and there are tests all along the way that the standards have to be there. There's a whole new pedagogy going on in our schools at this point. It's a sea change of teaching. So we talked about budgets, and I said, Jen, what does your budget look like right now? She said, it's strained. It's been strained for the last 2 years. I said, I talked to the teachers too. I said, our Board of Finance wants efficiency. And they looked me right back in the eye with dagger eyes and said, we want efficiency too. So they're there as well. It was a real education for me in a very few minutes. And what we're seeing here and what we're attacking tonight is the Wilton Schools District's crown jewel. The Wilton's crown jewel. With all the families moving in here, they're looking to move to Wilton because of the fine schools. And we are slicing and dicing this budget today. They've come to us with a big amount, they have. Let me turn this back to the Board of Education at this point to say that with 83% of the proposed budget for contractual increases, teacher staffing at this point, and it's pretty clear you're using all those people very efficiently. If we as a board come back and say, it's too much, this increase, 2.06%, or combined with the town budget, which looks like they're going to be stuck with some pretty significant increases are going to go away. Or if the taxpayers say this is too much of an increase, how are you going to handle this cutback and still keep the quality there? And that's the question I want answered. I'm sorry, it sounds like a congressional explanation here tonight. I apologize.
You yield the rest of the time?
So we engage in a process where we lay out some guiding principles. In fact, I met with the senior executive staff yesterday to review some of the principles. So there, as you might expect, principles like minimize impact on students, minimize impact on teachers, try to ensure reductions are equitable. To make those cuts, we would engage this Board of Education in the same process. I think if we were able to achieve cuts that wouldn't be damaging to kids, to teachers, to programs, you would have them. They would be in the original budget proposal. So that would lead us to go through a decision-making process where we'll have to make choices. So we'll be looking at programs. And then I think the next set of questions begins with, what are the core programs? Right, so do we just focus on reading, writing, mathematics, and core disciplines, and then look to reduce programs like art and music, which I would also consider are really the programs that draw so many of our kids to school and are the pride and joy for so many of us. But we have to engage in those conversations. Are they essential? What about world language? Is that essential? So I'm not pointing at any of those programs and saying that's where we would cut, but that would be the nature of the conversation. And ultimately what I would see or imagine was a gradual degradation of the quality of our system. Right, and that's something, we talk about why people move to Wilton and what they think about the schools. If we're talking, to the magnitude of $1 million, it's in the staffing drive the programs. And I think we have been engaged in a process of tinkering around the edges by consolidating, looking at a director position here, looking at, additional time someplace else. And all of those cumulatively have an impact. As a singleton, maybe not so much, you might not feel it in the first year, you might begin to feel it years out. I would make the point, as just an example, 4 years ago, there was a dedicated person who worked here in the school system, whose job was to make sure that the cameras worked, right, to film the Board of Ed meetings and to make sure that that was a position that I said it's not essential. There's a different way to do it, and we have this different way. It's not perfect, but it's a different way. So my point really is, there just are not those kinds of positions left in the system. And again, I think we may not feel the degradation immediately, but it's certainly going to be there. And so John, I think that's the best answer I can give you tonight.
Well, Kevin, we had some statistics come out a week or so ago that rated the Wilton schools, and on a scale of 100, it rated the Wilton school districts at 80.5, down from previously. Mm-hmm. I don't know, this was a state thing?
It's the state report card you're referring to.
Yeah.
Sure.
It rated Miller Driscoll at 98.3, down. It rated Cider Mill at 77.5. I asked Jen about that. Boy, she said, we're working hard to build that back up. Middlebrook, 74.1. Wilton High School, 84.5. So if we say, sorry, 2.06%, you can't have that, how's that going to impact this?
It's tough to draw the correlation because the factors driving the change in the state report card year over year, I think you need to remember where those numbers come from. So the large majority of those come from the state assessment system. For us, the state test, particularly in mathematics, is a lagging indicator. What it reveals also is the enormous achievement gap that we have between our special education students and our general education students. So, and then third driver that's contributing to the most recent dip there is around chronic absenteeism. So we have invested, as you well know, because we talked about it, enormously in trying to close the achievement gap between our special ed kids and our general ed kids. So if we target special ed kids, or target special ed programs, I think in that instance, we might see the gap widen. The point Jen made to you was about the shift in instruction in terms of our general ed classroom. And so the work we've had our coaches engaged in really is it's what you saw, the shift in the pedagogical model. The leading indicators right now for that model exist at Miller Driscoll, which makes sense because that's where we've invested the longest. And we have some leading indicators at Cider Mill, so we're going to see those indicators come back around.
I just want to compliment Jen about something too. It was just an amazing hour and a half, and I wish that all my colleagues could do the same thing. I know Jen said, bring them all.
Anytime.
And
As a Wilton resident and taxpayer, you can compliment her for the rest of the evening.
and two of the coaches were too. They said, we're interested.
Very worthy.
We're interested in taxes too. So we are rushing down the hall to a classroom, and a little girl comes by in tears, and I was with Jen and a coach. Poof, Jen is gone after that student. And we go into the classroom and we continue. And I keep thinking, what's happened to this little girl? And Jen comes back in a few minutes, and I can't talk to her about it, but at the end of the tour I say, what was that all about? And she explained, and she had straightened it out, and the little girl was fine. But I thought, 65 years ago, when I was in 4th or 5th grade, boy, the principal wouldn't have been there to do that. So thank you, Jen.
Thanks for being there. It was great.
So that's what I wanted to say.
Day in school. Good
Day in school. And I hope you fellas get a chance to go through and really see what'll happen. Because
I
if
think I might
we,
answer a lot of your questions.
if we,
You saw it.
if we just look at this numerically, it's not the right way. This is a human business here. It's not a corporation. These schools are very different. We can't take a division and say, we're not gonna have custodial services anymore. Do away with special ed. We've really got to look at that as a human too. So, excuse me, but
I think we do understand the intrinsic value. It is the major amenity in town, but we are a board of finance, and so we focus on finance. I understand that other people focus on other things, but that is our primary responsibility is finance. So that's why, we understand it. Trust me, all of us had kids going through the school system, know it very, very well. But we are a board of finance, and we have to make financial decisions on that. Next, the area I think we've already touched on was the value of coaching, instructional coaching. Richard, have we covered that already? or some
Yeah,
of it?
just like to clarify, I read through the response. Again, I'm probably looking at this too much like a quant, but I was impressed when I sat through the workshops about the positive feedback I got on the coaching program and understanding that it really was ongoing professional development for the teachers, and that clearly is an important thing that ought to directly improve the quality of the tuition. So of course the quant in me says, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could measure that improved performance? And I think, Debbie, you made the same point at one of the workshops, or maybe.
Yeah, no, just how can we tell that it's
Yeah,
successful? And I think, I don't remember which principal, whether it was Kathleen or Jen, but came forward with a document of some of the practices that have been since implemented, et cetera.
Right.
And then hearing the principals recount is good.
Yeah,
And then, I don't know at what point Kevin obviously knows the details, but when you go into a classroom and you look for specific instructional practices which are on the rise, which are getting stronger, and that you can tell somewhat through teacher evaluation, somewhat through teacher feedback, just the instructional shifts that are talking about with this sort of new landscape of different standards, et cetera. So there are probably other ways to just sort of capture a picture of the instructional skill set that teachers had and then are having and then have mastered. And it's a process, and the principals and Kevin and I know Chuck Smith are working on that. But I think it's a really fair question, that if you invest that much in personnel and that much in time and that much in finances, how do we know it's working? It's a terrifically fair question, and I think Kevin and team are working on getting more, some of it will be qualitative, but, more tangible, visual ways of seeing the difference between not having a coach and having a coach.
That's the key. Thank you, Debbie. She said it much better than I did.
I think that's probably the end of the structured questions. Walter had one question that didn't show up here. It came in today, so I'll just read it out loud. But this is coming from Walter, not from me. And it has to deal with participation fees and charges and collections. Athletic program represents an annual spend of about 1.2 million, expected to increase by 1.8% next year. Program serves just the high school, details by sport, participant counts, and can be found on page 118 to 151. Projections for 18-19 include the following: 613 boys in 14 sports, 728 girls in 16 sports, including cheerleading, and 30 unified served, whatever that is.
Unidentified, probably.
Unidentified?
It was
It's unified? Okay. Total served is 1,378 students. Obviously, some students play multiple sports. Understanding that there's a per participant fee of $125 per student per sport. Incredibly reasonable, given that the sports up to the high school level are an expense borne by the parents per participant per sport, ranging from $250 to $2,000, depending on sport. A lot of the premier sports you have to pick up a $2,000 to $3,000 tab for. I know firsthand because my boys have played Little League. Obviously, it's not me talking, because I have no boys. Babe Ruth baseball, Wilton youth football, Chelsea Piers water polo, and Wahoo swim team. I paid a $125 fee for my son to swim in his freshman year. When our children get to high school, the barometric pressure in Wilton changes that day as all sports parents breathe a collective sigh of relief that the cost per child per sport plummets to just $125. A family of 2 children, each playing 2 sports, realizes an annual savings of $800 to $1,500, demonstrably more for the high-cost sports like hockey. 2 issues should be raised this evening. Number 1, budget account 1425-620 on page shows collections of exactly $120,000 for the current year. Then what he did is he multiplied 1378 by 125 to come out with 172,000 of potentially collectible, 120 that was collected. So what happened to the 52,250 between projected and actual?
Spring sports?
I think it's all sports.
When is the fee collected is all I'm asking, I guess.
Because the fee's like 98% or 100% collected, right?
I would defer to.
Yeah, it's not for sport.
It's not per sport, correct?
It is per sport. Per sport. Yeah, I thought it was
Per
per
family.
sport.
It's 150, isn't it?
So why don't we just
That's why I want
get some
details about it.
clarification?
I knew that you guys wouldn't have the data
Yeah.
here, and it did come in.
They may not be collected until they enroll in the sport either.
Yeah, but if it's spring sports we haven't collected,
Spring sports
right.
are not reflected yet.
So if that's the case, then of these 1378, what portion is spring that's been
Sure.
projected but not collected? That could explain it. That's
It would still be in the
Is
budget.
that something you can forward to me, Jeff, so I can, because there's a lot of information in that one, if you could forward that question to me, so I can address it?
you can have this when I'm done with it. Okay?
Thank
The
you.
other thing I would say to that a parent in the Wilton school system pays a whole lot more for their child to participate in any given sport in addition to just the 125. And we as a board asked, Chris, thank you, I went blank, sorry, Chris. He's putting together an analysis for us that's going to outline by sport the exact expenses related to that sport, what's paid for by the school, what's paid for by the parents, what's paid for by the booster clubs, et cetera. And so we're awaiting that analysis still, because that was a question we as a board had too.
That would be helpful, and maybe see what some of the other neighboring
Absolutely.
towns charge. Because I think some of them charge higher than we have. And
Some of them, some
Last
charge
time we were
nothing,
talking about hockey, for example, and some of those
some
guys,
charge nothing.
where they charge $800.
Yeah, but like, for
Which,
example,
to the point that Walter raised, is a dramatic drop
from what they were paying before they got to the high school, because they were paying, hockey probably costs a few $1,000s per year.
And it
for
still
the parents.
does, because
Yeah.
we only provide the uniform that the hockey player wears. But all that padding, the stick, skates, helmet,
But
all of that.
it's really the ice.
The ice time.
And the ice time. So this is the analysis that we're doing, because there are some, because we were looking at it from an inequity perspective, how some sports,
Right,
the school, like football, we provide all the gear, or at least most of it.
Yeah.
Whereas hockey, it's only the
Yeah.
uniform.
Right.
That
when
sort of
we,
thing.
initiated the participation fee a few years ago, we looked really long and hard at what parents are
Right.
already paying beyond, just the participation fee. So it's not really accurate to say it's a collective sigh of relief that you get a taxpayer-funded free ride for sports now, because you still do have to pay for your equipment.
But they did
And-
before they got to the high school as well. I think that's Walter's point. Because before they got to the high school, they were still paying for the equipment.
Right.
And they were paying for private instruction, basically.
Yeah.
Right, but they were, the key there is private, they were, before they got to the high school, signing up for private organizations, so
Right.
this is a public high school, we offer sports as part
Right.
of their public education.
And the
But just
other-
like surrounding towns who have the same situation, public high schools, and they're paying considerably more, particularly for the higher value sports. But I think the one thing we've got to make sure we do is if we do decide to differentiate the cost by sport in terms of the high value versus lower value, we make sure we have scholarships available for people
Sure.
who otherwise can't afford to play.
Right.
We just thought that this would be an area that if there are cuts, that doesn't come into academics, just asking the
Well,
parents who've
yeah.
already paid more. My daughter was skier, and
There you go.
So
no one
you
ever
know.
bought her
Yeah.
skis except me.
Right.
And
Exactly.
boots.
Yeah.
We didn't provide skis.
No. But the thing is, we also have them for our own recreational use. so-
Right,
My
right.
son was a skier too, and we didn't pay for lift passes. That was in the school budget.
Yeah.
That's in the school budget, and transportation to get there is in the
Yeah.
school
So we
budget.
realize there's
Right, yeah,
some
yeah.
cost more than by the parents.
Yeah.
But
Oh,
if there
sure.
was an area that looks like it would have less academic impact, this is one.
And you should know that, and I think it's obvious, that this board is taking
Okay.
a very in-depth look at that as well.
Right.
It's the same questions we all had too.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing, the risk and the thing you need to think about is that we get annually from each of the booster clubs and each of the sports a significant amount of financial support. I can tell you, because I was the treasurer of the football boosters for a number of years, and that was in excess of maybe $80,000 to $90,000 a year. The equipment that we bought, provided, et cetera. We had to raise that money, and we raised it from the parents.
Yeah.
So the parents may only be paying $125, as we did for our son to play football, but we probably spent another $1,000 or $2,000 in supporting the booster club, raffles, this, that, and the other, buying tickets to the dinners, whatever it may be, to ensure that we had the money that we could spend to support the coach, buy the equipment, buy the cameras, buy whatever it was that the coach needed, to run the program, that the school didn't have to pay for. And that holds true for each of the booster
That
clubs,
was
some more
right.
substantial than football. So don't lose sight of the fact that the more pressure you put on the parent to fund an activity fee, the risk is that those dollars are now not going to go to the boosters, because that money would still have come to us, not directly, but it would have been in support of the program. Things for the kid. I mean, it's not fungible money, okay? It's real money, and either the parent pays it an activity fee, or they pay it an increased activity fee, or they cut back their booster support, because they can't do both. And if they cut back the booster support, then that's less money that the boosters are going to pay, in support of the programs.
Yeah.
It's very simple. It's easy math to do that.
As Bob O'Donnell knows, my wife was head of the soccer and the field hockey boosters, so we're well aware of that.
Yeah.
And we do
It's a
rely on
lot of money.
parents.
People, you don't
It's a lot
realize
of money.
how much
We do
money.
rely on parents to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
For instance, we buy the soccer nets.
Yeah. Hey,
Booster Club buys the soccer nets. Ironically, you can't play soccer without them, but they're not in the budget.
Right.
But the point is,
Yeah.
if we need to find other places, rather than going after academics, you go after other things that, clearly are important. I'm not saying cut that. I think the athletic program here is superb.
Yeah.
It really is. But, after paying $3,000 a year for Premier Soccer and then paying $150 a year as a freshman, there's a nice reduction in our fees, and some sports are like that.
Yep.
And those kinds of sports ought to be looked at, that you know, there might be a little bit that could be raised, and just compared to some other wealthier towns, maybe not Norwalk that doesn't have fees, but look what Darien or New Canaan or Westport charges.
I'm thinking Darien, they don't have fees.
Getting rid of their
None.
fees. Some of the schools
None.
have, this
Zero.
year, eliminated fees.
Yeah, they don't, they have no participation fee
The
The trend
whatsoever,
is,
Darien,
the
for
trend is
any
going in
sport.
the opposite direction.
Yeah, I wish we were that.
The schools are starting to eliminate the fees.
And also, we're just talking about sports, but parents already pay out of pocket for non-athletics. Like,
Yeah.
we talked about music, they're paying, you know, hundreds of dollars to participate in orchestra and band. And also, at the high school, they all just bought laptops for their kids, and maybe there are people in Wilton who, their kids already had laptops. But not every family in Wilton child had a laptop, and so we've already asked them. I mean, parents are constantly, it's not as if they're just like, ooh, high school, like, free ride. I mean,
Yeah.
parents are digging into their pocketbooks all the time.
Yeah.
And not saying that they should, you know, but just keep in mind that parents are already putting out some money.
Understood. The second question that Walter raised is referencing a report. I don't recall, but Walter's got a pretty good memory. 2 years ago, Kevin Smith and high school principal Bob O'Donnell agreed to study both participation and student parking fees. Don't recall seeing the results of that study, but saw it posed again this year. Did that study ever get
I have
produced?
the parking fees in front of me right now. I'll tell you what we found. This is from the DIRG. The high end was Ridgefield at 200. We of course charge 150. You have that on record. Many of the other schools charge what might be considered considerably less than us. Greenwich $40, New Canaan $40, Staples $50. The other schools that are on parallel with us charging 150 are Fairfield, both schools, Ludlow and Ward, and Joel Barlow. So I felt as if we were somewhere in the middle there. I think if the business department decides they want to talk about raising the fees, we have the data. Walter brings that up each year, but there are many schools charging much less than we do at Wilton High School.
Okay. Like I said, he's got a good memory on that. I'm just reading.
I was
for him.
anticipating the question.
Walter appreciates that. Okay, that really is the end of the questions. Let's go around the table one last time if anyone has any follow-up that they'd like to ask the Board of Ed while we're here. Huh? Stuart? No?
No, I just want to reiterate, you know, that all, I said this at the beginning of the last meeting, but all of us understand that the educational system is the crown jewel of Wilton. And equally, we understand that our job is to look after the taxpayer, and so we've got this constant balancing act. And all I can tell you is it's not an easy job. I was 8 years on the Board of Selectmen, and that's a walk in the park compared to this. So, just in terms of the difficulty of the choices you have to make, this is not an easy job. So bear with us if we look a little austere at times.
Yeah, I would have said the exact same thing as Richard said. He said it better than I did because he did it with a British accent.
It always sounds better.
But there's no question, and I want you to realize that we realize the value of this. Many of us came here for the schools, took our kids all the way through the school system, know a lot of the people that are in the schools today. We don't minimize that at all, but we are a Board of Finance, and we look at numbers, and we look at tax rates and external pressures on us, and this year's one of those years. It seems like it's always one of those years, but each time they kind of amp it up on us. And like I said, the litany of the parade of horribles that we had, that we talked about last meeting, the Board of Selectmen is going to hear the same lecture from me. And so we have to do that balancing act. It's not easy to do. It's not fun. If everything was easy, then we wouldn't be needed. So just bear that in mind. We don't get any great pleasure in cutting people's budgets. That's not something we enjoy doing. But we haven't gotten all the information yet. We still have public hearings for both sets of budgets. We still have to run our mill rate model to see what the increase in taxes would be at various spending levels. So we're only part of the way through the process, so it's a little premature to say anything at this point about where we're going to end up first week in April, okay? But appreciate you always come well prepared, and this year in particular with this, the report this year is much better organized than last year, makes it a lot easier to understand, and that's helpful. And we'll kind of keep the dialogue going, but thank you very much for presenting to us the budget.
Thank you. I think Ann has given out a sheet. Did everybody get the sheet you provided?
Everybody has that,
Yeah.
I think it's important to note, gentlemen, that if you look at Ann's sheet that she provided, that has a detail of the head count, et cetera, that over the 4 years, our budget has increased 1.3% over 4 years in dollars. And that's with a 3%, give or take, increase annually in compensation. We are looking at us being right now the proverbial turnip. And if you want blood, that's what it's going to be, sadly. We've gone up 1.3% over 4 years in dollars in our school budget. The fourth year being the one that we're looking at now for next year. I don't know what more you want from this administrative team or from the board. 1.3% over 4 years in dollars. That's all I have to say.
Okay, on that note, couldn't say it better myself. We're gonna motion to adjourn, or we'll just adjourn?
Oh, you're doing the minutes? Yeah.
Okay, thank you
Saying.
very much for your
You know, we
thoughtful
agreed that
questions.
20%
Thank you.
Gonna make or break the budget.
And thank you for hosting.